Dynamic Visualforce gives you the ability to dynamically render components based on a decision that's made in your controller extension. So in Apex, there's a number of these component classes for the different types of components that you would be working with. So for instance, here's an example of, this one's associated with a data table tag. So we have component dot, and then because this is a standard component, we have the Apex namespace, and then we have our data table. Okay? The way that this would work is that in your page, you would have the dynamic component tag, and here notice we're doing a binding to this header with due date check. What this header with due date check does is it returns a section header. And one of the things that we can do is we can dynamically set properties or attributes on that component and then return it down based on, in this case, we're doing an if condition based on whether or not this particular thing is overdone, overdue, or what have you. Okay? One of the things that you might use are custom components. Custom components start with the C namespace. And one of the things that we're able to do with a custom component is we're able to use custom controllers with it. Okay? So a custom controller associated with a custom component. All right? Now, what this gives you the ability to do, so here, for instance, is the definition of our component. Here, we would reference it inside our page. So in your component tag, it doesn't really show it here, in your component tag, you would specify an Apex class. What you would do with this is that in your custom controller code, you could create your own custom getters and setters. So a classic thing to do would be to, when I'm loading in my custom controller, I want to, for instance, maybe do a database query to get some information to populate my custom component with data. Or for that matter, do a web service call out, or I don't know what it's going to do. Okay? So you could place that logic in that Apex class and essentially through the controller attribute bind it to your custom component, and now anytime someone uses that, it would call your methods to pre-populate it with data to do whatever it is you need to do. Okay? All right. And this just kind of talks about the different things that go into custom components, which we go into detail in our Visualforce page class. So, the testing and deploying controllers. So let's talk about this. So controllers, and for that matter, controller extensions, are Apex classes. Okay? Therefore, we need to test them. Now, the primary challenge of testing a controller, or for that matter, a controller extension, is that normally what's interacting with our controller is a human being. So we have our human being, they're working an HTML page, they're doing things with a user interface that was generated from Visualforce. How do we replicate a user interacting with our interface that we created and ultimately calling the business logic, the behavior that we defined? What we can do, there's a number of things that we can do in order to make this work. So you don't have your data bindings within your Visualforce pages. They don't exist because the Visualforce pages themselves aren't there. So what you can do is you can explicitly call, in order to mimic an end user filling out a form, you would explicitly call setters. So depending upon how many setters you have, create your mock data and then call those setters to mimic a user submitting a form. Okay? Often our controllers are using SOSL, and in the case of SOSL, in a test, by default, Apex tests will never find any results when performing a SOSL search. Okay? And here's the thing, what makes it more complex, unlike SOCL, Because in a test with SOCL, we can write some data, some mock data, and then do a SOCL query and find that mock data. Unfortunately, we don't add records to the search engine until after the commit to the database has occurred. And since in a test, we never perform the commit to the database because we never want our test data, our mock data, to be persisted, you'll never see your records in a SOCL search. Okay? So in that case, there is a class in the test class is a set fixed search results. And so what you can do is you can essentially call that method to say, when you're executing the test, here are the records that you will find. Okay? So that when your business logic executes that SOCL search, it will have that primed and it will then find those specific records. Okay? So it's something you got to do in order to make that work. Okay? There are other things that you're going to need to do. If you're working with a controller extension associated with the standard controller, remember that we can instantiate the standard controller and pass it a record. So now it's working on a record. In order to use our controller extension, we would take the reference to the standard controller and pass it to the constructor of our controller extension, right? Because it's expecting to be passed a reference to the standard controller. Okay? The other thing that we can do is we can test navigation. So we can test our navigation by doing assert equals, and we can say, all right, if I call this action method, I should end up on this page. And so we would call the action method and then call getURL, which produces a string that represents the destination that we're going. And then if I know that if the user filled out the form correctly and they should land on the success page, I would then do page.success.getURL. In other words, when I fill out the form correctly and I click on my action method, I end up on the success page. We compare the two URLs, and now we know that our navigation works. Finally, if you think about your controller is calling apexpages.currentPage.getParameters. There's a method available which is test.setCurrentPage. And so you can instantiate a page reference and then call that method and say you are what is the current page. That way, when your controller executes and it calls apexpages.currentPage, it's going to find that page. You would also, on that page, do this. You would say call getParameters and put key value pairs on there. Okay? That way, inside of your controller code, when it calls getParameters.get and then that specific key, it will find that data. So what we're doing is we're mimicking that browser where the user is filling out, or the user has that URL with those query string parameters that the controller needs in order to do its queries or whatever it has to do. When you are debugging problems with your Visualforce pages, make sure that the Visualforce, isolate the problem, so make sure that the problem is associated with Salesforce. So for instance, network bandwidth might be an issue, network availability might be an issue, but isolate the problem. Both Apex transactions and Visualforce page requests are tracked in your debug logs, or for that matter, if you open up a developer console instance, you can check those out. Avoid iframes where possible. This is just a general best practice. One of the things that's tempting because it looks cool is to embed maps into things. It's like, oh, let's embed this data and let's embed that data, and people create these portals. And the problem is you have all these things waiting to load data from other URLs, and your page performance turns out pretty bad. So it's generally a best practice. Don't create that embedded, map. Instead, create the link out to the map. Then the user can request it when they want it, if they do want to take a look at whatever that may be. This is actually references old technology. One of the things that Visualforce now does is it only generates one form. Even if you have multiple forms, it's actually going to take care of that for you. We can use the transient keyword to keep the unnecessary data off the view state. There's also things like partial page refreshes, and you can, for instance, do things where you load up some data, but then the user clicks on something to expose, for instance, the details of a record, and then we do a partial page refresh and do that querying. So how are wizard controllers different from our other controllers? You have view state, and we have, yeah, exactly. So we're keeping track of state across multiple pages. What is the effect of the transient keyword? To keep that data out of the view state. Why would we use a custom controller on a custom component? What capability would we gain? So we could have custom getters. So our custom component might need custom getters to populate it with data, okay? Or for that matter, custom setters. How is testing a controller different from regular Apex class or trigger? So what were some of the considerations that I talked about? Yeah, so we need a mechanism. Because we often call Apex pages.current page, we need a mechanism to set the current page, which we have. We need to test navigation, and so we can do that by calling action methods and checking our page references to see that if a user, for instance, filled out a form correctly or incorrectly, we forward them to the correct place. Very good. Yeah, we need to prime up, to prime the results that we get back from salsal searches. Set fixed search results is the name of the method, and we need to say here are the records that you find when you do your next salsal search. So very good, very good. We also do things with respect to the HTTP query string parameters. So we can create on our page reference, we can put items on there, and then inside our controller code, when we call get, we will find those. All right. And then when we're working with controller extensions, we can always create an instance of a standard controller and pass it to the constructor of the controller extension. Okay, so let's do this. We have a short survey. If you could fill that out, I'll give you some few minutes to fill it out, and then some privacy. I will come back, and what we'll do is we'll devote the rest of the day to working on lab exercises for those of you who want to work on them. Otherwise, thank you for attending. Okay.